Hey guys, we are going to continue reading Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone by J.K. Rowling. So where we left off, we kind of find out about the Dursleys, and Mr. Dursley is just noticing some unusual things happening on a Tuesday morning. Let's continue. Fear flooded Mr. Dursley. He looked back at the whispers as if he wanted to say something to them, but he thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, and snapped his secretary for not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there was lots of people called Potter who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure if his nephew's name was Harry. He'd never even seen the boy. It might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he had had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in the cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon. When he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into somebody outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realized that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset for almost being knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he said in a squeaky voice that made the passers-by stare, "Oh, don't be sorry, my dear, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who has gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy, happy day." And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought that he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car and set off home, hoping that he was imagining things, which he had never hoped before because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he spotted in the morning. It was now sitting on his garden wall. He was sure it was the same one. It had the same markings around its eyes. "Shoo!" said Mr. Dursley loudly. The cat did not move. It gave him a stern look. Was this normal cat behavior, Mr. Dursley wondered? Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner about Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a new word, shan't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusual today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why owls have suddenly changed their sleeping pattern. The newsreader allowed himself a grin, most mysterious. And now over to Jim McGruffin with the weather. Going to have any more showers of owls today, Jim? "Well, Ted," said the weatherman, "I don't know about that. But it's not only the owls that have been acting oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of rain that I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating the bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a very wet night tonight." There's a cool looking owl. Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars over England? Owls flying by daylight? Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place? And a whisper about Potters. Mrs. Dursley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. He'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat. Petunia, dear, you haven't heard from your sister lately, have you? As he expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended that she didn't exist. No, she said sharply. Why? Funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there were a lot of funny-looking people in town today. So, snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought maybe it was something to do with, her lot. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he dared to tell her he heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he casually went on as he could. Their son. He'd be about Dudley's age now, wouldn't he? Guess so, said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, right? Harry. Nasty common name if you ask me. Oh, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject until they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down in the front garden. The cat was still there. It was staring down Privet Drive as though it was waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could this have all been something to do with the Potters? If it didn't, if it got out that they were related to a pair of, he couldn't think to bear of it. The Dursleys got into bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well that he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia could get mixed up in anything that could be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was. Mr. Dursley might have been drifting into an uneasy sleep, but the cat on the wall outside was showing no signs of sleepiness. It was sitting still as a statue, its eyes fixed, unblinking, on the far corner of Privet Drive. It didn't do so much as quiver when a car door slammed in the next street, nor when 2 owls swooped overhead. In fact, it was nearly midnight before the cat moved at all. A man appeared on the corner the cat had been watching, appeared so suddenly and silently, you thought he would have just popped out of the ground. The cat's tail twitched and its eyes narrowed. Nothing like this man had ever been seen on Privet Drive. He was tall and thin and old, and judging by the silver of his hair and beard, which were both long enough to tuck into his belt. He was wearing long robes, a purple cloak which swept to the ground, and high-heeled buckled boots. His blue eyes were light and bright and sparkling behind half-moon spectacles, and his nose was very long and very crooked, as though it had been broken at least twice. This man's name was Albus Dumbledore. We'll stop there for now, and I will keep reading for part 3 today.